Hello, welcome to this video about plagiarism. I'm going to go over what plagiarism is, why it's bad, and how you're going to be able to avoid it. I try to avoid just shaking my finger at you and saying don't plagiarize, it's bad, because I think you know that, you've been taught that before, but there's a lot of nuance and difficult little parts of plagiarism that can make it hard to actually spot or to avoid, and my goal for this video is that you actually know the different kinds of plagiarism and you know how to identify them and avoid them. So you should end up with the tools and the skills to do really well in your assignments and avoid those pitfalls of plagiarism. So first, what is plagiarism? It's sharing someone else's thoughts or their ideas as your own. So it's not necessarily just about taking word for word what somebody said, but it could also be taking their ideas without telling us about where those came from. That could be for anything, whether it's a published book or your friend's ideas. You need to attribute both of those. There are 4 overall kinds of plagiarism, and I've split them up here into this table so that you can kind of get a sense of what the differences are. There's a difference between things that you're quoting versus things that you're paraphrasing or putting into your own words. You certainly can paraphrase. It's a great idea, actually, so that you don't just end up with a series of quotes as your paper, but you really integrate it into your own ideas. But you'll need to attribute those ideas regardless of whether you're doing it word for word as a quotation or whether you're putting it into your own words. And then you also need to think about whether you're using the quotation marks when you are doing a word for word quotation and whether you're paraphrasing sufficiently. So you don't just want to do what we call a find and replace, where you just replace a couple keywords, but it's basically the same sentence. That's not really putting it in your own words. That's just find and replace. So it's insufficient paraphrasing. If you're going to paraphrase, you really want to go for it, put it in your own voice, with your own spin on that sentence, but still attributing it. So the 4 kinds we have are quoting without quotation marks, but it's attributed. Paraphrasing, but not paraphrasing well enough, but still attributing the ideas. Not attributing a quotation, even though you're using the quotation marks. And paraphrasing well, but without saying where you got those ideas from. So those are the 4 types of plagiarism. Now I'm going to go through a couple of quotations and give you some examples of this. So here are 3 different quotations that I've taken out of a book of quotations. So the first one, "Only those who are being burned know what fire is like," by Waters in His Eyes on the Sparrow. The second one, a poem by Langston Hughes, "Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." And the third one, which is another quote by Ingram in Respect Yourself. "If you disrespect everybody that you run into, how in the world do you think anybody's supposed to respect you?" So these are 3 quotations. I've used quotation marks and I've attributed where I got it from. For the purposes of this video, I didn't worry about what that format is for the citation. I'm just trying to make sure that there's something there that tells you where I got this information from. We'll get into citations in a different video, so just hold tight for that. But the important thing is that we quote when it's a quote, we paraphrase when it's a paraphrase, and that we let our readers know where we got the information. That's the attribution. So the first example, let's take that first quote. "Only those who are being burned know what fire is like." Here are 3 different ways that somebody might use that, all of which are plagiarism. The first one, "Only those who are being burned know what fire is like." This one, you might notice, it's an exact quotation, it's in quotation marks, that's all great, but I didn't attribute it. The second one, "Only those who are being burned know what fire is like," Waters, His Eyes on the Sparrow. This one is a direct quotation, and I have attributed the information, but I didn't use quotation marks, so that is a form of plagiarism. The third one, "Only those who are on fire know what being burned is like," Waters, His Eye is on the Sparrow. This is that find and replace paraphrasing. I replaced burned with fire, I replaced fire with burned. It's really just a minimal change in that sentence, and it doesn't change the sentence itself. I did attribute it, so that's something, but I didn't really put it in my own words. The final one It is the experience of something that allows a person to understand the full reality of that situation. This is a real paraphrase. That's a totally different sentence, but it is interpreting what that sentence said and is sharing it. What I didn't do is say where I got that idea from. Let's do one more example or set of examples just so that you really get a good sense of this. This is the third quotation from that original list. If you disrespect everybody that you run into, how in the world do you think anybody is supposed to respect you? Ingram, respect yourself. So the first one, you can see that I used quotation marks. That's great. It's a direct quotation, but I didn't include the attribution or the citation. Second one, it's again, word for word. I have attributed it, but I forgot the quotation mark, so I pretended like that was my way of putting it. At the third one, if you're not respectful to everyone, nobody is going to respect you. That's that find and replace paraphrasing. So I tried to put it in my own words, but I really didn't do a great job of it. I still used the same sentence structure. I still just kind of changed it from being not respectful as opposed to disrespect. Nobody is going to respect you rather than why do you think anybody's supposed to respect you? Really the same sentence there, not sufficiently paraphrased. And the fourth one is actually a pretty different way of doing it. Ingram argues in Respect Yourself that respect is a reciprocal relationship, and that if you do not provide respect to the people in your life, you are unlikely to receive that respect in return. This one's a little tricky because this is not plagiarism. I've included my attribution. I didn't do it in parentheses like the other ones were, but I did it in the sentence, and that actually counts. That's a great way to do it. And I put it really in my own words. It's a totally different sentence. It's my own interpretation of it. So that brings us to an important question. Why is plagiarism important? We now know 4 different kinds of plagiarism, but why do we care? This is my dog Lulu. I just thought you'd enjoy seeing her quizzical face about why plagiarism is important. So plagiarism is really an important part of our honor code. If you're taking somebody else's work and sharing it as your own, then you're doing a couple of things. For one thing, you're not getting the education that you should and that you're paying for, and that's a hardship for you. You should put in the work because that is what education is. It's putting in the work so that you can grow. The other thing is that you might be taking the work of somebody who did not give you permission to take that, and that's really stealing from them. The other part of that is even if somebody knows that you're taking their work, you're pretending that it's yours. So you are essentially conducting a fraud on your readers. They thought they were reading your work, and it turns out that that's not the case. So these are issues of ethics, and we need to think about who we're harming. And it's not a crime without a victim. You might be harming your friend who you might be taking it from. You're harming yourself because you're not putting in that work, which you deserve to do. And you're harming the institution because when we graduate students, we're saying that we know that you can do all of the work that we assigned to you and that you did it well. And when you've plagiarized, that is no longer the case. It turns out that we didn't know that about you, even though we thought we did. So your employers are hiring you based on a qualification that you didn't actually earn in that case. So those are some of the reasons that plagiarism is important. So what I was just talking about, I was talking about the difference between fraud, which is a deceit or a tricking. So you're trying to pretend that something that isn't true is true. Trying to pretend that the fact that you didn't write it is actually that you did write it. And that's as opposed to theft, which is stealing something. So like I said, you might have a friend who says, don't worry about it, just copy this answer, I'm fine with it. So in that case, it's not a theft. You didn't steal it. You were given permission to use it, but it's still a fraud because you're pretending to your audience, in this case your professor, that you did the work that you didn't actually do. So these are 2 different categories of plagiarism, but they're both plagiarism. There are times that you might have taken something, you see a paper lying around and you say, that's actually a good paragraph. I think I'm going to take that. Or a good sentence. I'm going to take that. Or a good idea. I'm going to take that. That would be a theft and a fraud, but there will be times that it's not a theft, but it's still a fraud. So consider these issues when you're thinking about whether what you're doing is plagiarism. Are you taking it without permission? Are you pretending it's yours when it's not? When it comes down to it, plagiarism isn't always against the law, but it is against the honor code, which is the law of our institution. So you've already seen this, you've already signed this. This is Maine Maritime Academy's honor code, and it specifically says that any student found to have committed or to have attempted to commit misconduct, such as the following, is subject to disciplinary sanctions under this code. Plagiarism, such as the A, use by paraphrase or direct quotation of the published or unpublished work of another person without full and clear acknowledgement, or B, unacknowledged use of materials prepared by another person or entity, such as the use of term papers or other academic work that was purchased. So you can see in this definition, we're talking about paraphrasing, direct quotations, whether it's published or not, so whether it's a book or a friend's paper, without that attribution, but also it doesn't have to have been stolen. You might have purchased it, that's a legal act to do, but then passing it off as your own to the academy goes against the honor code. So knowing that, let's just have a few FAQs about plagiarism. The first one, what if it was done unintentionally? So you didn't mean to plagiarize, but you did. Well, for one thing, you've now been watching this video, so you know what plagiarism is. You have the tools to avoid it. So to some extent, that now means that you can't say that you didn't understand that it was plagiarism. Now, if it's an honest mistake, then talking about that with your professor when they bring it up with you will do you a lot of good. It's not going to be helpful to say, well, it's not plagiarism because I didn't do it intentionally. Plagiarism, as you noticed, it's not about intent. It's about fraud. It's about theft. The word intentional wasn't really thrown around there. Now, if it's intentional, that does make it worse because we all make mistakes and we all learn from our mistakes. But if you're doing it intentionally, that's not a mistake, and the consequences for that will be much more severe. Keep that in mind. Don't let it stop you from trying things. But when you're uncertain, because these aren't always going to be cut and dry cases, ask your professor. If you're concerned that you haven't paraphrased something well enough, talk to them about it. Ask. If you're not sure what their expectations are around how much attribution you're giving, just ask. There's never going to be a consequence for you trying to do your diligence and to work hard to avoid plagiarism. That being said, you don't have to just go to your professor. You can also come to the library because we are here to deal with these issues. That's part of what we're really good at. So librarians are another location where you can ask those questions, figure out whether you need to do something different, whether you've paraphrased it well enough, whether you've cited it correctly. We're here for you. The second one, what is the harm if I have the permission of the original author? And I mentioned this a little earlier in the video, that your work here is us signing off that you can do the things that you are required to do. And we're overseen by large entities and government entities that put their trust in us to make sure that that's the case. So if you have not followed the rules of the classes, you have put forward work that isn't your own and you didn't do that work, then you're trying to convince us to sign off on your learning that didn't happen. So that's that fraud piece. And third, isn't it sometimes better to plagiarize a little rather than turn in an assignment late? This is really different outcomes here. Sure, you can turn in an assignment that's been plagiarized, but the consequences for a plagiarized assignment are significantly worse than the consequences for late work. If you need more time, talk to your professor. They may or may not be able to extend deadlines, but you will know that you are doing what you can and you're turning in what you can. I'll say it's always better to turn in work that's not your best than work that's not your own. We all have to make some choices sometimes about how much time we spend on different assignments, but you can turn that in knowing that you did your best under the circumstances that you had. And the more that you give yourself some time and some planning, the less this is going to be an issue. So I would argue that the consequences that would come with turning in plagiarized work are just not worth it. Don't even play with it. Finally, what are those penalties for plagiarism? That might be academic probation, that might be receiving an F on the assignment or the course, and it might be expulsion, it might be suspension. There are all sorts of different consequences that might come about depending on the severity and the intentionality of your plagiarism. Just keep in mind, at this point, you have the tools you need in order to succeed, so you should be able to avoid plagiarism, and you should be able to ask when you're not sure so that you can 100% avoid plagiarism. So just a little food for thought here. These are things that you might have heard from parents, professors, coaches, other people in your life, but I think that they have a lot of important things to say about plagiarism. One is that how you do anything is how you do everything. So if you find yourself starting to just put other people's words into your assignments or their ideas into your assignments, that really does say a lot about where your values are. So I would challenge you to decide at this point that putting in the work is worth it. It's always worth it, and even if you can't put in as much work as you think you should, putting in the work you can and not taking those side ramps and off ramps that will lead you down a path that would actually be pretty risky and harmful to you, it's really important. Just do the work you can, work on the ways that you can, and avoid this plagiarism issue entirely. The second is really about that feeling when you think that you just don't have enough time in order to accomplish an assignment. And that is, a lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. Not having enough time is not an excuse for plagiarism. If you plan your time well and you use those time management techniques that you're learning in PD or any of your other classes, then you're not going to run into this as an issue as much as you might. Now, you might still run out of time, and that's just how it works. You might still have to prioritize what you work on, but you will be able to do enough and turn in enough of your work that you simply don't need to use that as an excuse. We're at the end of this video. We have a few questions right after this that you should complete about plagiarism and identifying issues of plagiarism, and then we'll move on to the next section. Thank you.